Hello and welcome everyone to another RIS interview. I'm delighted today to be talking to Dr. Antonia Witt, who's a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, that's the PRIF. She's also the head of the African Intervention Politics Research Group and is currently working on a project on local perceptions of African regional organizations and their involvement in political crises within their member states. Antonia has written an article for BISA's Review of International Studies, also commonly known as RIS, it's on Beyond Formal Powers, Understanding the African Union's Authority on the Ground. Welcome, Antonia, and congratulations on the article.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to get straight into the interview, so I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about yourself and your academic journey. How did you become interested in this area of research?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to present my work in this format. I have a background in international relations, African studies, and peace and conflict research. And I've always tried to combine my interest in the international as a social space with a regional focus on the African continent. I think in essence, I'm interested in understanding how the international, and in my case, I mean with the international, the norms and policies of international and regional organizations, and more specifically, now how these norms and policies affect the everyday life of individuals and whole societies. And again, in my case, individuals and whole societies in different African states. So if I were to sort of summarize this, I think I'm really interested in understanding in an everyday localized perspective on the international and its political effects. Now, this article actually stems from my PhD research, which I completed quite a while ago, but which obviously still fascinates me and still gives me enough food for thought. The very initial idea or inspiration for this research actually came when I was working at the European Union delegation to the African Union in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia as a trainee right after I had completed my studies. Now, while I was there, I had learned from the literature about the African Union's anti-coup norm. What is that? It is a norm that prohibits African states to be ruled by governments that come to power unconstitutionally, or in other words, a norm that outlaws coup d'etats. But this anti-coup norm not only prohibits coups, it also gives the African Union a mandate to bring the respective country back to constitutional order. So at that time when I was working at the EU delegation to the African Union, several of these efforts to re-establish constitutional order in different African states were going on. And I observed that in the diplomatic circles in Addis Ababa and at the AU itself, there was a great commitment to this anti-coup norm and a great sense that this norm is an important instrument at the AU's disposal and a sign of the organization's greater concern for democratic governance and constitutionalism on the continent. Now, and this sort of discourse also matched pretty much the discourse in the academic literature at that time about the anti-coup norm. Now, this taken for grantedness sort of made me a bit suspicious. I was wondering what these efforts, to which everyone seemed to attach so much importance, what these efforts actually do. What does it mean to re-establish constitutional order? And what does it do on the ground? How does it affect politics and order in the countries concerned? So these are the questions that I asked myself, and that was the beginning of my journey.
Wow, well, that's all very interesting. For those who haven't read your article, could you just give us a little, a brief outline of what how it pans out?
Sure. In this article, I bring my empirical insights, which I gained over the course of time about the African Union's post-coup interventions or anti-coup interventions. I bring these insights together with the literature on the growing authority of international organizations. The African Union's anti-coup norm is one area in which the African Union has increasingly gained authority over the past maybe 20 years. Now, authority is generally understood as a relationship of super and subordination where one actor has the right to command and require deference from others, and which, unlike power, rests on the general recognition of the right to direct others on usually very specifically defined issues. So this right and recognition is an important aspect of authority. But I found the way in which international relations scholarship deals with the issue of authority of international organizations a bit unsatisfying. Very concretely, I observed that IS scholars have predominantly focused on the so-called sources of authority. That means where authority comes from, so to speak, but much less so on what it actually does. So the concrete effects of IO authority on those addressed, including the individuals and whole societies. Now, with this article develops a bottom-up perspective, as I call it, to study international authority, and it is an attempt to show why international relations scholars should become interested in understanding the effects of international authority more specifically, and how they could do so. Now, I do so in this article based on an in-depth case study on the African Union's enactment of its authority to govern coups, based on a case study on Madagascar, a post-coup intervention that lasted about 5 years from 2009 to 2014, and a collective attempt to re-establish constitutional order after the country had experienced a coup in 2009. Now, concretely, I address two related questions, and I hope that I answer them as well in my article. That is, first, how is the African Union's authority to govern coups really exercised in practice? And what does it really do on the ground, in this case, in Madagascar? And what effects does it have on politics and order on the island?
So you mentioned, you were just talking there about the dominant understanding of the authority of international organizations. Why do you find that that dominant understanding, in IR insufficient?
Yeah, first of all, it is maybe important to say really that IR scholars have so far studied the authority of IOs from very different theoretical angles, but predominantly the literature has been shaped by liberal institutionalist or constructivist perspectives. But despite this sort of breadth, there's still some commonalities in terms of what these approaches take into sight and what not, so what they leave out. In general, one can say that IS scholars have, for the most part, taken the understanding of authority in nation states and sort of transplanted that understanding to the international level. This is what I call the sovereign imaginary in this article. Now, this move has two consequences. The first consequence is that the scholarship has mainly been concerned with those holding authority and with the reasons why they do so. So with the sources of authority, as I said before, such as formal decision-making powers or adjudicating powers, etc. So with the capacities of those holding authority. What has received far less attention is whether and how these formal powers or capacities actually matter. In fact, most of the time that they matter has simply been assumed. Now, the second consequence of the sovereign imaginary is that IS scholars have largely focused on the authority relationship between IOs and states. That is, how IOs exercise authority over states and the extent to which states comply with the rules and decisions made by international organizations. Now, this, in my view, neglects two important issues. First, it neglects how states are being made and unmade through the growing authority of international organizations. For instance, through the definition of shared political standards for legitimate statehood. And secondly, the focus on IO state relations neglects how IO authority, in fact, is actually deeply penetrates states and thereby not only governs states, but also different social groups and individuals directly. Now, the bottom-up perspective that I'm taking on in this article is meant to shift the analytical gaze away from the sources towards an understanding of the effects of international authority And this is not meant as a sort of competing or alternative approach, but really in the sense of a sort of complementary approach to what we already know about or how we've been studying international authority. Maybe I could just add this, that in order to, or in developing this perspective, I'm drawing much on a Foucauldian understanding of authority as governmentality, which shifts the analytical gaze away from those holding power and instead focuses on the effects which the enactment of governmental rationalities has on the formation of subjects. Now, one important aspect in of this approach, or this analytical lens, is that it is interested in the way power serves to subjectivate in the double sense of the word. So one's subjectivation as the making of subjects, so an enabling effect that power can have, and on the other hand, subjectivation as subjugation, so as a constraining effect that power can have on those addressed. So the idea is really to understand how the authority of international organizations, as inscribed in particular political rationalities to govern certain issues like coups in my case, how this at the same time enables and constrains certain actors in their respective realms of action.
Okay, so what is the African Union's real authority with regard to coup d'etats on the continent?
Yeah, since the adoption of this anti-coup norm, which I mentioned, which happened in 2001, so actually the African Union didn't exist at that time, but its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, was still the continental organization. Now, this anti-coup norm gives the AU a sort of twofold authority. On the one hand, or first, it gives the AU authority a formal authority to judge political events in African states and to identify infringements against shared political standards. And the second authority that is attributed through this norm to the continental organization is that the AU with this norm has the formal authority to re-establish constitutional normalcy in situations in which this normalcy is interrupted, so in coup d'etats of different kinds. Now, with this, the African Union claims authority over the conduct of putschists and other political actors in the member states concerned, as well as over the conduct of other international actors like the European Union, the United Nations, in fact, as well, or other bilateral partners, who are all, in the AU's view, required to align with the African Union's position and to support the re-establishment of constitutional order in that particular question in case. Now, within the sort of institutional setup of the African Union, this authority is mainly enacted by the Peace and Security Council, which is a key decision-making organ of the African Union that consists of 15 elected member states, and which can in fact take binding decisions. So if you look at this scenario, it really is a matter of delegation of key decision-making powers to a, in this case then, supranational body. Hence, exactly what IA's scholarship on the authority of international organizations has so far mainly focused on. But as I show in this article, neither the way this authority is exercised nor its practical effects can be inferred merely from these formal powers. So this is where, in my view, it is important to really move beyond this focus on formal powers and capacities. Now, I think you asked about this authority in reality, or how it really matters, which I think connects maybe to a widespread assumption about sort of regional organizations or institutions in the global South as mainly being toothless paper tigers, because we see quite a lot of quite a lot of paper work and sort of formal powers, but maybe little action. And I think in this case, this is not true. So first, in reality, we really see that this authority of the African Union is quite regularly enacted. In fact, in 18 times already since the adoption of this norm, it had been invoked, and constitutional order in one way or the other has been re-established in different African states. And as we speak, 4 of these efforts or situations are actually going on the continent right now. But secondly, it is also important to stress, and maybe that's why you asked in reality, that the practice obviously deviates quite a bit from what the paper sort of assigns to the African Union. And that means that in practice, this authority is obviously not as easily enacted as it is imagined in the policy doctrines. The whole point of my article is that even though this authority is not enacted in the envisaged way, it is still effective. That is, it is still powerful in shaping political realities on the African continent and the conditions under which citizens in affected states live and will continue to live in the future.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about how it plays out in practice. What about the effects, and a little bit about the effects on this authority? But what are those effects on the authority of the countries and societies concerned?
Yeah, maybe without sort of going into empirical details, I think the article is rather rich in that. I think I can summarize it maybe like this. With regard to the effects of this authority, I show in the article that the AU's authority to govern coups really serves to prescribe a particular model of political order that focuses on realizing people's right to choose how and by whom they want to be governed, by promoting inclusive power sharing and more or less democratic elections. And all this is sort of the AU's measure to deal with political conflicts. But it's important that this is a sort of a prescribed ideal or imaginary of political order. And this imaginary structures not only the way that the political crisis in Madagascar, in this case, was resolved or not, it also defines how and by whom Malagasi's will be governed in the years to come. So it really has an important imprint on politics and order on the island. And this is, I think, important. It effectively blocks alternative efforts to addressing the political crisis that led to the coup d'etat in the case of Madagascar in the first place. So it really is a powerful effect. On the other hand, I show in the article that the AU's demand to re-establish constitutional order was only realized through the inscription, as I call it, of Malagasy actors, political actors mainly, based on the principle of inclusivity and ownership. So quite a widespread norms in the AU's practices as well. So while none of these Malagasy actors was really coerced or forced into obedience, their realm of action was also really restricted to fulfilling the African Union's demand for an inclusive and consensual transition and for quickly organizing elections. So this simultaneity of prescription and inscription is exactly what a governmentality perspective can render visible with its focus on the simultaneously enabling and constraining consequences of the enactment of political rationalities, as I mentioned before. Now, with regard to the practical enactment, that was sort of my second question of this authority. I show that the AU's desire to exert its influence on coups was really realized in a distant and diffuse way, in which in fact a variety of national but also international actors were involved, and in which the AU effectively evaded to govern the situation in Madagascar more intrusively. So in practice, it pretty much was in contradiction to the sort of idea of governing coup d'etats as it is inscribed formally in the anti-coup norm. Now, in sum, I think the enactment of the African Union's authority had far more general consequences for politics and order on the island than the sovereign imaginary, as I called it in the article, and this focus on the African Union's compulsory powers vis-a-vis putschists or those infringing the anti-coup norm, how these imaginaries would suggest, and which sort of would have been studied with a perspective that's more predominant in international relations scholarship. The AU's legal and formal capacities were, of course, very crucial for why the organization became involved in restoring constitutional order in the first place. But neither the way the AU authority was put into practice, nor its effects can be really attributed merely to these formal capacities alone. And I think this is exactly why we should sort of as I said, move beyond these formal powers.
Okay, thank you. So could you very briefly, in conclusion, sort of give us the main takeaways of the article?
Sure. I think the article has several takeaways for sort of different audiences. It possibly addresses, so to those interested in regional organizations or the African Union specifically, I think the article demonstrates that even though maybe not enacted in the envisaged way of sort of, the formal policy doctrines, the AU's legal frameworks still can have very powerful effects on politics and order on the continent, something that is still quite often, in fact, put into doubt. And then more importantly, maybe to IELTS scholars' interests in international organizations and their authority, the article underlines the importance of moving beyond this sort of fixation on formal powers and capacity towards an understanding of authority as practiced, as lived, including its concrete effects on the lives of individuals and societies. I also show that this goes hand in hand with a more relational and sort of decentralized understanding of international authority, which operates because the nature of the international is exactly not that of the nation state writ large. It operates in a much more diffuse and network manner. I also show that this authority is importantly linked with the reconstitution of the state. So it cannot be seen as something separate from or merely exercised over states. And I think in altogether, a lot more needs to be done to really study and describe the nature of IO authority. And this, I think, will surely also require more sort of in-depth field research and engagement with the messy realities of the places in which the international becomes visible. Now, I think this is actually important not only academically, so to make our analytical vocabulary more reflective of reality. I really also think that this is important politically. Why do I think so? In times when international authority is increasingly politicized, and I think this is what we all see, I think IS scholars could really offer a valuable contribution to public discourses about or the politicization of international authority, about Brussels, about the worst trade deal, etc. And they could do so exactly by rendering visible how and where IO authority actually affects our lives. And I think a lot more needs to be done in this regard. And this could really then become a sort of analytical groundwork for a constructive or a transformative rather than a regressive critique of international authority and the existing institutional order currently in place. I think such a critique is really desperately needed against the otherwise really growing regressive forces around the globe that we see.
Okay. Well, Antonia, thank you very much for giving us this great insight into your research. It's been really wonderful to hear what you have to say. For those of you listening who are keen to learn more, you can read Antonia's full article in the first view section of the RIS website. If you're a BISA member, you can access this free of charge. It's part of your membership. You just need to log on to your account. And if you're not a BISA member, you may be able to see if you can get access via your institution. And while you're here, please do look at our website, the BISA website, which is www.bisa.ac.uk. You can learn all about the association and all the wonderful benefits a BISA membership would bring you. So please do take a look. And with that, thank you once again, Antonia.
Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you and goodbye.